The laughter in the opulent auction hall died instantly as William Anderson pulled the weathered parchment from his worn jacket. The auctioneer's gavel froze mid-air when William's steady voice cut through the sudden silence. This proceeding is halted under the authority of the original Castle Hawthorne deed, granted to my ancestors in 1742 and never legally transferred. Gasps rippled through the crowd of wealthy bidders as security guards stepped toward the plainly dressed farmer, whose mud-caked boots had left tracks across the mansion's marble floor. The auction house director, Patricia Montgomery, adjusted, her designer glasses with manicured fingers that trembled slightly as she examined the ancient document William had placed before her. Before we jump back in, and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The July heat pressed down on Riverdale County like a hot iron, flattening everything. Beneath its unrelenting pressure, for William Anderson, each passing day brought him closer to losing everything his family had built over 8 generations. The housing development company had claimed his neighbors' farms one by one. Today, they would claim Castle Hawthorne, the historic estate that bordered his remaining 60 acres, the final piece needed to complete Westfield Development's luxury community project. William checked his grandfather's pocket watch as he guided his battered Ford pickup down the winding country road toward Riverdale's historic courthouse. The truck's air conditioning had given up 3 summers ago. Another repair postponed as property taxes climbed and farm income dwindled. Sweat trickled down his temple despite the open windows. The back of his neck burned from long days working his remaining fields, trying to coax enough yield from the land to make the payments the bank demanded. "You're going to wear a hole in that steering wheel, Dad," said Emma from the passenger seat, her voice gentle but concerned. At 24, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that belied her years. Necessity had transformed her from a carefree college student to his essential partner when his wife Sarah had died unexpectedly 2 years earlier. Emma's blonde hair was pulled back in a practical braid, her clear blue eyes, so like her mother's, watching him with barely concealed worry. William consciously relaxed his white-knuckle grip, "Just running through our options. All 17 of them that we've discussed since breakfast." Emma attempted a smile, reaching across to place her hand briefly on his arm. The gesture reminded him of her mother, another similarity that sometimes caught him off guard. The corner of William's mouth twitched upward despite everything. 18. "I thought of another one after we passed Miller's Creek." "Oh, yeah? Is it better than your plan to challenge Mrs. Montgomery to a harvesting contest for the deed?" This time, William actually chuckled. More realistic, but not as satisfying. Their banter couldn't fully mask the gravity of their situation, but it was their way, finding moments of light even as shadows closed in around them. It had been 30 months since Westfield Developments had arrived in Riverdale, buying up struggling farms and historic properties to create Hawthorne Estates, an exclusive gated community with luxury homes starting at $2 million. 30 months of community meetings, historical society appeals, zoning board hearings, and increasingly desperate attempts to preserve the rural character of a community that had existed since colonial times. The worn leather portfolio on Emma's lap contained every record of their fight, petitions signed by long-time residents, correspondence with preservation societies, appeals to state historical commissions, and finally, the collection of old documents William had discovered 3 weeks ago while clearing out his grandfather's storm cellar. "These papers have to mean something," Emma said, as if reading his thoughts. Her fingers tapped the portfolio rhythmically. "The Anderson connection to Hawthorne goes back centuries. They can't just erase that history for some gated community." "History and law aren't always the same thing, sweetheart," William replied. his voice carrying the steady patience developed through 5 decades of working land that gave no quick rewards. Development companies don't pause multi-million-dollar projects for family stories, no matter how deep they run. As they crested the final hill before town, Riverdale spread out before them, a once thriving farming community now transforming into an upscale bedroom community for the city 60 miles east. The courthouse stood at the center, its limestone facade and modest clock tower unchanged since 1890, when William's great-great-grandfather had served as county commissioner. The courthouse parking lot held an unusual number of vehicles for a Tuesday morning, including several identical black Range Rovers with the Westfield Developments logo emblazoned on their doors. The sight of them caused a muscle in William's jaw to tighten. The Development Corporation had been systematically acquiring properties throughout the county for the past 3 years, their representatives appearing at every auction, foreclosure, and estate sale with seemingly unlimited capital and meticulous planning. "Vultures in expensive suits," Emma muttered as they found one of the last available parking spaces. "They don't need disguises when they're winning," William replied, gathering the quiet dignity that had seen him through drought, flood, and now served as armor in a different kind of battle. As they approached the courthouse entrance, the burly vigor of Jack Thompson stood waiting, his weather-beaten face breaking into a warm smile beneath his ever-present Riverdale High baseball cap. At 68, Jack had run the county's farm supply store for nearly 40 years, becoming something of an unofficial historian for the agricultural community. His presence at the auction was both support and witness. "Thought you might try to make a run for it," Jack said by way of greeting, briefly clasping William's shoulder with calloused fingers strong from decades of hefting feed bags and farm equipment. "The thought crossed my mind," William admitted, "but Anderson men don't run, even when we probably should." Jack nodded toward the entrance. "They've got quite the corporate team in there. CEO herself, from what I heard." "Catherine Westfield," William confirmed, unsurprised. "We've met." 6 months earlier, Westfield Developments had made what they termed a generous pre-auction offer for any information or documents related to Castle Hawthorne's history, $50,000 with immediate payment. William had declined without hesitation, recognizing the predatory nature of the proposal despite its presentation as historical interest. "Any word from Michael?" he asked, referring to his younger brother who worked as an archivist at the State Historical Society. Jack shook his head. "Called my niece, who works in administration there. Said Michael was trying to get away, but there was some emergency authentication request this morning." William nodded, unsurprised but disappointed. His brother had been fighting through bureaucratic channels on his behalf for months, trying to navigate the complex process of securing historical protection for properties with significant cultural heritage. So far, the results had been promising in theory, but painfully slow in practice. Applications disappeared into administrative review. Historical designations required multiple approvals, and auction dates arrived faster than preservation decisions. "We've got what we need," Emma said with determined optimism, patting the portfolio under her arm. "Let's do this." The interior of the courthouse maintained its 19th century dignity, high ceilings, polished wood, and the slightly musty scent of old books and furniture polish. The auction was being held in the main courtroom, already nearly full when they arrived. William registered the room's composition with the situational awareness that came from years of watching weather patterns and predicting market shifts. Local farmers and long-time residents clustered together on one side, Westfield's team on the other, with various county officials and auction house staff distributed throughout. Catherine Westfield sat in the center of the corporate contingent, reviewing documents with focused efficiency. At 52, she projected the polished confidence that came from building a development empire from the ground up. Her silver-streaked dark hair was styled in an elegant bob, her tailored suit the color of money, her entire presence calculated to convey authority without obvious aggression. She glanced up as they entered, her expression revealing nothing beyond professional acknowledgement. William led his small group to seats near the back, nodding greetings to neighbors and fellow farmers as they passed. Each face carried variations of the same expression, sympathy mingled with the guilty relief of those whose properties had thus far escaped Westfield's attention, though many harbored private fears about how long their own land would remain untouched. "Montgomery's reviewing the final auction details with Judge Harrington now," murmured Susan Reynolds, the county clerk who had graduated high school with William 30 years earlier. "They're starting with Castle Hawthorne since it's generating the most interest." Judge Robert Harrington had presided over county affairs for nearly 2 decades, his reputation built on strict adherence to procedural correctness rather than emotional considerations. William had appeared before him only once, during a water rights dispute that had been resolved with the judge's characteristic efficiency and neutrality. A subtle shift in the room's energy announced the judge's arrival before he physically appeared. Conversations quieted, postures straightened, and attention focused on the door behind the bench. Patricia Montgomery, director of the auction house handling the sale, took her position at the podium, her designer suit and perfect makeup contrasting sharply with the weathered faces of Riverdale's farming families. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Judge Harrington entered with measured steps, his black robe lending additional gravity to his already authoritative presence. The room fell silent as he took his seat at the bench, briefly surveying the assembled crowd. "Court is in session," announced the bailiff, the Honorable Judge Robert Harrington presiding over today's public auction proceedings. The judge nodded to Patricia Montgomery, signaling her to begin. "Good morning," she began, her voice carrying the practiced charm of someone who had transferred millions of dollars in property with nothing more than well-timed inflections. "Today's proceedings include the auction of 7 historic properties, beginning with the landmark known as Castle Hawthorne, Lot 117, along with its surrounding 53 acres. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Castle Hawthorne wasn't actually a castle, but a stone manor house built in the late 1700s by one of the region's founding families. Its distinctive towers and limestone walls had given it its nickname generations ago, and the name had stuck even as ownership had changed hands through the centuries. "Due to the historic nature of this property," Montgomery continued, "we will begin with a brief overview of its provenance and current status before opening the bidding." She gestured to a young assistant who began distributing glossy brochures featuring professional photographs of the property. William noticed they had carefully avoided capturing the encroaching development that already surrounded 3 sides of the estate. Castle Hawthorne was last purchased in 1963 by the Carter family, who maintained it until Elizabeth Carter's passing last year. As Ms. Carter had no heirs, the property was transferred to the Riverdale Historical Trust, which has determined that maintenance costs exceed their endowment capabilities. The trust has authorized today's sale with proceeds to fund other preservation efforts throughout the county. William felt a familiar anger rising. The trust consisted of 3 appointed officials, 2 of whom had business connections to Westfield. Developments, the decision to sell rather than preserve, had been made with remarkable speed after Elizabeth's funeral. "Before beginning the bidding process," Judge Harrington interjected, "the court recognizes any legitimate claims or objections to the proceedings. Are there any such matters related to the Hawthorne property?" This was the moment they had been preparing for, the narrow window when legal intervention might still be possible. William rose from his seat, Emma following with their leather portfolio. Patricia Montgomery watched their approach with the slightly bored expression of someone who had witnessed similar last-minute objections before, all inevitably dismissed. "Mr. Anderson," Judge Harrington acknowledged as they reached the presentation table, "the court recognizes your right to present relevant information before auction proceedings commence." William straightened his shoulders, the habitual posture of someone who had spent decades standing firm against storms, both literal and figurative. "Your Honor, I'm here to present historical documentation suggesting Castle Hawthorne was originally part of a land grant to my ancestors in 1742, with specific provisions regarding its transfer and ownership that may impact today's proceedings." He placed the collection of documents on the table, acutely aware of the room's collective attention. Catherine Westfield leaned forward slightly in her seat, her expression revealing nothing beyond professional interest despite her company's substantial investment in acquiring this final piece of the development puzzle. Patricia Montgomery examined the materials with practiced efficiency, her reading glasses perched low on her nose. Her fingertips briefly tapped the yellowed parchment, the physical manifestation of centuries of history that William had discovered buried in his grandfather's storm cellar. "Mr. Anderson," she finally spoke, removing her glasses with deliberate care. "While these documents are certainly fascinating from a historical perspective, they appear to be incomplete copies rather than original legal instruments. The chain of title for Castle Hawthorne has been thoroughly researched by our legal team, and no connection to your family appears in the county records." "The documents aren't copies," Emma interjected, her voice clear despite the tension evident in her posture. "They're original provisions from the colonial land grant that established both properties. Our family has maintained continuous possession of our portion for 8 generations. The continuous possession of your family's farm," Montgomery completed her sentence with practiced precision, "not Castle Hawthorne, which has a separate and well-documented chain of title dating back to 1801. She pushed the documents back across the desk with a small, practiced movement. "I'm sorry, but these materials don't constitute a legal claim on the property. The auction will proceed as scheduled." William remained perfectly still. 50 years of facing unpredictable harvests, maintaining his composure when lesser experience might have faltered. This was the outcome he had anticipated, but fought against anyway, because surrender had never been in his nature. Not during the drought of 89 that had nearly ruined him, not during the flood of 97 that had tested his resolve, and not now in Riverdale's courthouse. "So that's it?" Emma's voice carried clearly through the hushed room, a tremor of emotion finally breaking through her carefully maintained composure. 8 generations of history, documents that clearly show the properties were meant to remain connected, and you won't even allow time for proper authentication before selling off one of the oldest estates in the state. Montgomery's expression remained professionally neutral. "The auction house's position is consistent with all applicable property laws and previous court rulings regarding similar situations. The auction will proceed." Judge Harrington cleared his throat. "If there are no further legitimate claims, bidding will open at $1.5 million for the Castle Hawthorne property, comprising the main house, outbuildings, and 53 acres, parcel number 117, in accordance with the notice of sale published in the county register." William's hand found Emma's shoulder, offering silent support as they turned to return to their seats. The tight knot in his chest wasn't for himself. At 57, he had lived through enough to know that life continued beyond disappointment, but for the generations before and after him. For his great-grandfather, who had maintained the stone boundary wall between the properties through 2 world wars. For his father, who had shared the water rights during the drought of 54 that had nearly bankrupted both properties. For Emma, who should have inherited not just land, but legacy, continuity, belonging. They had taken only 3 steps when the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with decisive force, the sound reverberating through the suddenly silent room. The suit registered first. Not the expensive designer wear of the developers, but the practical, well-tailored attire of a man in his early 60s, a leather messenger bag slung over his shoulder. Behind him stood 2 younger assistants carrying document cases and what appeared to be scanning equipment. The unexpected entrance immediately commanded the room's attention. William froze mid-step, recognition dawning as the man strode purposefully down the center aisle. Beside him, Emma's grip on his arm tightened in silent question. Dr. Thomas Reynolds moved forward with the confident efficiency that came from decades of academic authority, his posture and pace revealing nothing of his age. The distinguished professor of American history from the State University approached the judge's position directly, presenting official documentation with practiced movements. Judge Harrington, I'm Dr. Thomas Reynolds, Director of the Colonial Archives Preservation Project. I'm here to request an immediate 21-day stay on this specific auction under the Historical Authentication Act, Section 403, regarding properties with potential national historical significance currently undergoing verification. The judge examined the documents with careful attention while whispers raced through the suddenly animated audience. William remained rooted in place, unable to process this unexpected development. Beside him, Emma's expression transformed, hope kindling where moments before resignation had begun to settle. These appear to be in order, Judge Harrington finally stated, looking up from the papers. Though this is certainly an unusual intervention at this stage of proceedings. Catherine Westfield rose from her seat with deliberate grace, moving forward, with the confident precision of someone accustomed to controlling difficult situations. Your Honor, she began, her voice modulated to convey both respect and authority. Westfield Developments must object to this last-minute interference with established auction procedures. The property has been properly noticed for sale for the statutorily required period, and Mr. Anderson has had ample opportunity to present his historical claims through normal channels. Dr. Reynolds turned slightly, his gaze falling on the developer with academic assessment. Ms. Westfield, I presume your company's particular interest in colonial properties has recently become a matter of scholarly attention. The statement landed in the courtroom like a stone in still water, subtle ripples of reaction spreading outward as its implications registered. A flicker of something, surprise or concern, crossed Catherine's features before professional composure reasserted itself. We operate entirely within legal parameters, Dr. Reynolds, she replied, her tone maintaining careful neutrality. Our development approach is guided by market opportunities and community enhancement considerations. Legality and historical preservation sometimes maintain considerable distance from each other, the professor replied evenly before returning his attention to the judge. The Historical Authentication Act authorizes temporary stay while our team conducts emergency authentication of potentially significant documents, which Mr. Anderson's brother Michael brought to our attention this morning. Judge Harrington studied the documentation for several more moments, his expression revealing nothing of his personal assessment of this unprecedented intervention. The auction of the Castle Hawthorne property is stayed for 21 days, pending historical authentication. All other properties will proceed as scheduled, following a 15-minute recess. This court will reconvene regarding the Hawthorne matter on August 3rd at 9 a.m. The gavel fell with decisive finality, transforming the atmosphere in the room from grim certainty to confused possibility. Catherine Westfield immediately engaged in intense conversation with her legal team, their huddle projecting urgency despite their attempts at discretion. Throughout the room, whispers erupted as community members processed this unexpected reprieve. William stood momentarily frozen, the farmer's discipline now failing him, as the whiplash of emotions from resignation to tentative hope disrupted his carefully maintained composure. Emma's arms wrapped around him in a brief, fierce hug before she pulled back, questions evident in her expression. Dr. Reynolds approached them directly, extending his hand. "Mr. Anderson, I apologize for the last-minute nature of our intervention. Your brother Michael has been quite persistent in bringing these documents to the proper authorities." "Michael did this?" William asked, still processing the dramatic turn of events as he automatically returned the handshake. "Your brother identified patterns in the documents you discovered that align with a collection we've been authenticating from the Williams estate in Charleston," he confirmed. "The similarities in land grant language and the specific covenant provisions regarding these properties became something of a catalyst for our emergency authorization. We have much to discuss, but perhaps not here." As the professor gestured toward a conference room where his staff had begun setting up what appeared to be a portable authentication lab, Catherine Westfield intercepted their path with practiced social grace that barely masked her evident concern. "Dr. Reynolds," she began with diplomatic precision, "while we certainly appreciate the academic community's interest in historical documents, delaying this auction creates significant complications for regional development planning and economic revitalization. Perhaps we could discuss a more expedient resolution that satisfies all parties' interests." The professor regarded her with the measured assessment of someone who had evaluated historical claims across multiple eras and jurisdictions. "Ms. Westfield, I've reviewed your company's acquisition patterns across 3 counties with particular attention to colonial-era properties. We will indeed have a discussion, but I suspect it won't proceed in the direction you're anticipating." Catherine's professional mask momentarily slipped, revealing the calculation beneath. As she processed this response, she nodded once and withdrew, rejoining her team who were already engaged in rapid reassessment of their position, phones appearing as they presumably contacted corporate headquarters. In the small conference room, adjacent to the courtroom, William finally found his voice as the reality of their temporary reprieve settled in. "I don't understand. We've been trying to get these documents authenticated for weeks with nothing but waiting lists and processing delays. What changed?" Dr. Reynolds nodded to one of his assistants, who opened a laptop displaying a map of Riverdale County, with properties highlighted in different colors: red for recently developed parcels, yellow for those in process, green for those currently protected under historical designation. "What changed, Mr. Anderson, is that someone finally connected the dots between targeted acquisitions and colonial covenant erasure," he explained, his tone shifting to the precise academic cadence familiar. "To generations of his students, your brother didn't just advocate for your individual claim. He identified a pattern that raised significant concerns regarding historical preservation of interconnected colonial properties, with specific transfer restrictions." Emma leaned forward, studying the map with sudden understanding dawning in her expression. The Covenant lands, they're not just buying random properties, they're systematically acquiring parcels specifically protected by colonial transfer restrictions. "Precisely," the professor confirmed. "And when that pattern aligned with the accelerated sales of properties where historical authentication coincidentally experienced delays, it triggered interest at levels that Ms. Westfield and her corporate associates probably didn't anticipate. For the first time in months, William felt something beyond desperation and determined resistance, a cautious hope that the historical connections he had sensed throughout his life might actually be validated when it mattered most. "So what happens now?" he asked, Now, Dr. Reynolds replied with the confidence of someone accustomed to coordinating complex academic investigations. We have 21 days to accomplish 3 objectives: authenticate your documents and establish their legal standing, document Westfield's acquisition pattern for the Historical Preservation Committee, and prepare for what will certainly be a more complicated legal challenge when we return to court. As the academic team efficiently organized their approach, William stepped momentarily away, moving toward the conference room windows that overlooked the rolling farmland beyond, fields and homesteads that represented not just real estate transactions, but the heritage and future of a community shaped by generations of care and commitment. Emma joined him there, standing shoulder to shoulder as they had through every challenge since her mother's death. "It's just a delay, isn't it? Not a solution," she observed quietly. William placed his arm around his daughter's shoulders, his gaze fixed on the distant view of their farm, the stone wall his great-grandfather had rebuilt after the tornado of '32, the oak grove where he had proposed to Sarah on a summer evening 27 years ago, the fields where he had taught Emma to drive a tractor when her legs barely reached the pedals. In farming, we have a saying, "You don't have to see the harvest to plant the seed," he replied. 2 weeks ago, we had no path at all. Today, we have 21 days and unexpected allies. His expression held the tempered hope of someone who had seen both abundance and loss across decades of working the land. Sometimes that's enough to change the entire season. Behind them, Dr. Reynolds and his team had already established secure communication with the State Historical Society, setting in motion processes that would reverberate beyond one family farm to address systematic issues affecting historical preservation throughout the region. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in months, it was no longer a desperate last stand, but the beginning of a new campaign, one where the rules of engagement had suddenly and dramatically changed. The authentication lab that Dr. Thomas Reynolds' team established in the Riverdale County Historical Society building bore little resemblance to the sleepy local museum it had been just days earlier. 3 large workstations displayed different aspects of their investigation, one showing ultraviolet analysis of the paper and ink composition of William's documents, another comparing handwriting samples from authenticated colonial records, and a third mapping property boundaries from multiple historical periods. Academic precision had transformed small-town operations into a specialized research center with surprising efficiency. William Anderson watched this transformation with the measured assessment of someone who had evaluated soil and seed with similarly careful attention throughout his life. Though he had been a farmer rather than a scholar, he recognized the methodical approach to evidence gathering and pattern analysis. What he couldn't fully process was that this academic rigor was being applied to save his family's heritage. "Your brother will be joining us shortly," Dr. Reynolds informed him, glancing up from an ancient ledger where he had been reviewing colonial-era property transactions. "He's been temporarily released from his regular duties at the State Archives. Given his familiarity with both the local history and the specific document collection." "Michael orchestrated all this?" William gestured toward the operation unfolding around them, still struggling to connect his quiet, bookish younger brother with the intervention that had halted the auction. The professor's expression softened, slightly, academic distance yielding momentarily to human connection. "Your brother recognized something that initially appeared to be isolated coincidence, but proved to be potentially systematic. When colonial properties in this region with specific covenant provisions experienced accelerated sales at rates 279% higher than comparable historical properties, he began documenting the pattern." "That sounds like Michael," Emma observed from where she'd been studying the property boundary maps. "He's always connecting pieces of information where other people just see random facts." Mum used to say he should have been a detective instead of an archivist. His analytical abilities have proven invaluable, the professor acknowledged, though I suspect his motivation was more personal than professional in this case. Before William could respond, the research room door opened, and Michael Anderson entered with the slightly hurried movements that had characterized him since childhood. At 49, he maintained the lean frame common to both Anderson brothers, though his desk-based scholarly career had given him a pallor that contrasted with William's weather-tanned complexion. His eyes, the same deep brown as their father's, immediately sought his older brother across the room. "I told you those documents were significant," he said by way of greeting, a hesitant smile suggesting both pride in his accomplishment and uncertainty about its reception. William crossed the room in 4 strides and pulled his younger brother into a tight embrace, a rare physical demonstration from a man more accustomed to stoic endurance than emotional expression. "You certainly did, though significant seems a bit understated for mobilizing an emergency authentication team," William replied, his voice rough with emotion. Michael returned the embrace briefly before stepping back with characteristic self-consciousness. "It wasn't just me. Once I identified the pattern, I contacted Dr. Reynolds, who had been researching similar covenant provisions in Williamsburg. The historical significance escalated from there." "Your brother is being modest," the professor interjected, approaching the siblings. He compiled an extraordinary analysis correlating property transfers, historical covenant violations, and the specific language patterns in colonial land grants. "We've had researchers tracking preservation issues, but the targeted acquisition of interconnected covenant properties represented a connection we hadn't established." William studied his brother with newfound appreciation. Their relationship had always been complex. The older brother who followed their father into farming and stewardship of the land, the younger who pursued education and archives. Different paths that occasionally created distance despite their underlying connection. "So what exactly did you uncover?" he asked, genuine curiosity replacing his initial disbelief. Michael hesitated, glancing toward Dr. Reynolds, who nodded permission for him to continue. He moved to the central display, showing the property maps, and activated a timeline function that demonstrated property transfers over the past 5 years. "It started with me trying to figure out why the historical significance of your documents kept hitting administrative roadblocks," he explained, his voice taking on the precise cadence he used when cataloging important collections. "When I cross-referenced other accelerated property transfers, I noticed 76% involved properties mentioned in colonial covenant documents." The display highlighted properties in blue, creating a pattern that followed the region's original settlement boundaries. "Initially, I thought it might be coincidence, but when I looked at properties without covenant restrictions in the same areas, they processed at normal rates through historical review. Only the covenant-restricted properties were fast-tracked through sales." Michael's finger traced the pattern on the screen. "Then I started tracking who purchased properties after these expedited sales. With a few keystrokes, properties began changing color on the display from blue to red as they transitioned from family ownership to corporate holdings. Westfield Developments acquired 23 of the 28 covenant-restricted properties, all located at strategic points controlling what were originally communal resource areas under colonial governance. The pattern emerged with undeniable clarity, a systematic acquisition of properties that would effectively eliminate the historical restrictions on development and resource management. They weren't just buying random historic properties. They were executing what appears to be a deliberate strategy to dismantle colonial covenant protections, which is potentially legal, though historically devastating." Dr. Reynolds added, "What crossed into potential legal concerns was the correlation with authentication delays, specifically affecting properties they appeared interested in acquiring." You're suggesting they're somehow influencing the historical review process, William asked, the implications beginning to register. That's a very serious allegation that we're investigating but haven't yet confirmed, the professor stated firmly. What we know with statistical certainty is that the pattern exists. The causation remains to be established. Emma had moved to stand beside her father, studying the display with increasing understanding. Our farm sits at what used to be called Covenant Creek, she observed, pointing to their property on the map. The original documents suggested it. Had some special significance in the colonial arrangement, Michael confirmed. Your property contains what colonial records refer to as the Covenant Stone, a marked boundary marker mentioned in multiple land grants as the anchor point for the entire regional covenant system. Based on the old surveys, it should be located somewhere near your north field. The revelation settled over William with heavyweight clarity. The persistent interest from Westfield in acquiring his property, the generous pre-auction offers, the presence of their CEO at what should have been a routine local auction. All of it reflected not just opportunistic business, but strategic historical erasure. Is this even legal? He finally asked, the question directed at no one in particular. Purchasing properties with historical restrictions falls into a complex legal area, replied Jessica Miller, the preservation attorney on Dr. Reynolds' team, who had been quietly analyzing documents in the corner. Covenant law varies significantly based on the original provisions and subsequent modifications, but systematically dismantling a colonial governance structure through targeted acquisition potentially violates several preservation statutes, particularly if the original documents can be authenticated. And the authentication delays? Emma pressed, the edge in her voice reflecting months of frustration with administrative obstacles. Jessica's expression tightened. If evidence established deliberate interference with the authentication process to facilitate property acquisition, that would constitute several serious violations, potentially including federal preservation law infringements, which is precisely what we're here to investigate, Dr. Reynolds concluded. But our immediate priority is authenticating your documents, Mr. Anderson. Ms. Miller will be personally overseeing the legal implications while our team continues the broader investigation. A knock at the research room door interrupted their discussion. Lisa Chen, who had been coordinating with local officials, opened it to reveal Jack Thompson, still wearing his farm store cap despite the academic surroundings. Sorry to interrupt, the older man began, his weathered face creased with concern. But there's something happening that y'all should probably know about. Dr. Reynolds nodded permission for him to continue. Westfield's people are making calls all over the county, Jack explained. They're offering immediate purchasing agreements to every property with potential historical significance. Cash offers, 25% above market value, closing within 48 hours. Word spreading fast. William and Michael exchanged glances of understanding. They're trying to secure as many properties as possible before whatever you're investigating becomes public, William stated rather than asked. Standard corporate containment strategy, Dr. Reynolds confirmed, unsurprised but clearly concerned. Ms. Chen, activate expanded documentation protocols. Ms. Miller, contact the State Preservation Office regarding potential temporary freeze on historically significant transactions. The academic team shifted into heightened operational tempo, the room buzzing with purposeful activity. William stepped aside, drawing Jack and his family into a quieter corner. How are folks responding to the offers? He asked, knowing that 25% above market value would be powerfully tempting to landowners who had been struggling for years with economic pressures that increasingly favored development over traditional land use. Jack removed his cap, worrying its brim between work-thickened fingers. Mixed. Johnson family's already signed. Robert's medical bills have been piling up since his surgery. Miller's are holding off, saying they want to see what happens with your situation first. Others are on the fence. The weight of community. Responsibility settled across William's shoulders, heavier in some ways than his personal situation. His case had somehow become a fulcrum point that would affect far more than just the Anderson farm. "We need to talk to people," Emma said. The determined pragmatism that had helped them weather numerous crises asserting itself. They need to understand what's really happening here before they make decisions they can't take back. Michael nodded in agreement. Community meeting at the Grange Hall. Most of the affected properties have been in families for generations. I can coordinate with the Historical Society to present what we've found. I can make some calls, Jack offered. Get the word out for tonight if that works. As they began coordinating this grassroots response, Arjun Patel, the research assistant analyzing the property transfer patterns, approached Dr. Reynolds with evident urgency. Their conversation, though conducted in professional murmurs, carried sufficient gravity to draw attention. "Doctor," the assistant concluded, "if our preliminary assessment is accurate, Westfield would control approximately 83% of the original covenant-protected lands once pending acquisitions are completed. That exceeds the threshold for historical district dissolution under State Preservation Statute 412. The professor's expression remained neutral, but the subtle straightening of his posture communicated the significance of this analysis to anyone familiar with academic bearing. "Prepare a preliminary briefing for the Historical Commission by 6 p.m. We need to move on this before further acquisitions occur." He turned toward William and his family, his professional demeanor softening slightly. "Mr. Anderson, your community meeting may prove valuable beyond local concerns. Would you object to members of our team attending in an observational capacity?" "Of course not, sir," William replied automatically, rural courtesy still ingrained despite the circumstances. "Excellent. Mr. Patel and Ms. Miller will accompany you." His gaze shifted to include Michael. "Your brother has demonstrated considerable analytical abilities. I believe you'll find him a valuable asset in explaining the situation to your community." As they prepared to depart, William found himself momentarily alone with Michael, the operational buzz providing background to a rare moment of brotherly connection. "Thank you," he said simply, "for seeing what the rest of us missed." Michael shrugged, uncomfortable with direct appreciation. "I just connected some documents. Anyone could have." "But they didn't," William interrupted. "You did, and it might save not just our farm, but a lot of others too." A slight flush colored Michael's cheeks. "Well, you spent 40 years preserving land that I only read about in archives. Consider this my attempt at catching up." The comment revealed the underlying current that had always run beneath their relationship, Michael's unspoken sense that his academic career somehow measured less against his brother's hands-on stewardship and commitment to the family legacy. The misconception had created distance that neither man had fully addressed over the years. "Different kinds of stewardship, Mike," William replied, using the childhood nickname he had abandoned years ago. "Both necessary." The moment of connection was brief but significant, a small bridge across years of unspoken comparison and perceived difference. As they moved to join the others, the brothers walked with the synchronicity of men who had rediscovered a shared purpose after years of parallel but separate paths. The Riverdale Grange Hall stood as a testament to the community's agricultural heritage. The sturdy red building with its white trim and wide porch had hosted everything from harvest festivals to wedding receptions since its construction in 1927. Tonight, it would serve as a rallying point for a different kind of communal effort than those commemorated in the faded photographs lining its maple-paneled walls. By 7 p.m., the main room had filled beyond capacity. folding chairs occupied by concerned landowners and their families, with others standing along the walls and spilling out onto the wraparound porch, where open windows allowed them to hear the proceedings inside. The turnout reflected both the gravity of the situation and the efficiency of rural communication networks. Jack's afternoon calls had spread through the community like wildfire, drawing even those who rarely attended public gatherings. William stood at the front of the room, the familiar discomfort of public speaking warring with his sense of responsibility. Behind him, a projector displayed the covenant map Michael had prepared, simplified for clarity but still showing the unmistakable pattern of Westfield's acquisitions. "I appreciate you all coming on such short notice," he began, his voice carrying the steady authority developed through years of making difficult decisions that couldn't wait for perfect conditions. "Most of you know our farm was scheduled for auction today, and you've probably heard something about what happened at the courthouse." Murmurs of confirmation rippled through the crowd. Rural news traveled with remarkable efficiency, though often with varying accuracy. What you might not know is why historical authorities intervened, or how it connects to the offers many of you have received today from Westfield Developments. He gestured toward his brother, who stood nearby with Jessica. "Miller and Arjun Patel, my brother Michael uncovered something that goes beyond just our family's situation, and I believe you all need to hear it before making decisions about these purchase offers." Michael stepped forward, his natural reserve momentarily overcome by the importance of the information he carried. With methodical precision, he explained the pattern he had discovered, the correlation between historical significance and accelerated sales, the systematic acquisition of covenant-protected properties, and the implications for the entire colonial governance structure that had shaped their region for centuries. As understanding spread through the room, expressions shifted from confusion to concern to outright anger. Robert Johnson, who had already accepted Westfield's purchase offer earlier, that day rose shakily to his feet, his lined face pale beneath his farmer's tan. "Are you saying they deliberately targeted our places? That the delays with historical reviews weren't just bureaucratic backup?" The medical alert bracelet on his wrist caught the light as his hand trembled slightly, evidence of the heart condition that had contributed to his decision to sell. "The investigation is ongoing," Jessica Miller answered carefully, stepping forward. "What we can confirm is the statistical anomaly in processing times for properties within the original covenant boundaries of interest to Westfield. The causation remains under investigation." "That's lawyer speak," called Martin Miller from the back of the room. At 71, he had the blunt directness of someone who had spent his life working land that demanded absolute honesty. "What's it mean in plain English?" "It means there's smoke, and we're looking for the fire," Arjun replied, his precise diction carrying the authority of his research background. "The pattern is too consistent to be coincidental, but establishing precisely how it occurred requires further investigation." Emma stepped forward, her youth belied by the clear purpose in her expression. "What matters right now isn't just the legal questions, but what happens to our community if one corporation effectively erases the historical protections that have preserved our region for centuries." This practical framing shifted the conversation from abstract historical patterns to immediate community concerns. Generations of landowners who had made decisions based on individual property rights were suddenly confronted with the implications of systematic covenant erasure. "These offers they're making," asked Sarah Miller, whose family operated a small orchard that had been fighting financial pressures for years. "Is that just to keep us quiet? Are we being bribed?" "Corporations operate on calculated risk assessment," Michael explained. "When our investigation became apparent to them this morning, their risk analysis changed. Acquiring properties quickly at a premium represents less financial exposure than potential regulatory intervention in their development strategy." "So they're trying to empty the barn before anyone counts the horses," Jack translated, provoking knowing nods throughout the room. The discussion continued for nearly 2 hours, moving from shocked realization to practical considerations. Jessica Miller outlined the legal protections potentially available through historical covenants, while Arjun explained the broader preservation implications of colonial governance structures. Community members raised questions about property rights, corporate accountability, and the economic pressures that had made their lands vulnerable to acquisition. Throughout the meeting, William observed the gradual transformation occurring among his neighbors, from isolated individuals facing private financial struggles to a community recognizing their collective heritage and potential strength. It reminded him of barn raisings and harvest cooperatives, the way shared purpose could transform separate families into coordinated community. As the formal portion of the meeting concluded and people broke into smaller discussion groups, Catherine Westfield appeared at the hall entrance, her corporate polish distinctly out of place among the practical attire of the farming families. Her arrival created a ripple effect of awareness, conversations quieting as attention shifted toward this unexpected presence. With characteristic directness, she moved toward William, navigating the suddenly watchful crowd with practiced composure. "Mr. Anderson, I was hoping we might have a word." "Anything you have to say to me can be said in front of my neighbors," William replied evenly. "We've moved beyond private negotiations." Catherine assessed the room with quick efficiency, recognizing the unified front that had formed during the evening's discussion. Her expression revealed nothing, but the slight adjustment in her posture suggested strategic recalibration. "Very well," she acknowledged. "Westfield Developments would like to propose an alternative approach that addresses community concerns, while still meeting our business objectives. We're prepared to establish a heritage preservation zone within our development that would maintain selected historical features while providing substantial infrastructure investment." The offer hung in the air, its calculated precision revealing both corporate adaptation and the recognition that their original strategy had been compromised. It represented textbook damage control, concede some historical preservation to maintain core development objectives, trade aesthetic recognition for fundamental transformation. "That's an interesting proposal," William responded carefully, though its timing suggests tactical repositioning rather than genuine historical concern. "Business adapts to changing circumstances, Mr. Anderson. Practical men like yourself should appreciate strategic flexibility." Her gaze shifted momentarily toward the academic representatives present before returning to William. "Our proposal would guarantee preservation of key historical markers while providing capital for infrastructure improvements many of you couldn't independently afford." Martin Miller's voice cut through the murmurs of consideration her offer had triggered. "And what happens to the covenant restrictions on development and resource management?" The question identified the central evasion beneath the corporate olive branch. Aesthetic preservation of selected features would effectively neutralize the substantive restrictions while appearing to honor heritage. Heritage preservation allows for balanced modernization within historical contexts, Mr. Miller. Catherine replied smoothly. Selective conservation would naturally carry certain advantages over rigid adherence to outdated restrictions. "That's not an answer," Emma observed, moving to stand beside her father. Her youth and education represented the next generation of stewardship, the future that hung in the balance of these negotiations. "You're offering to preserve the appearance of history while eliminating its substance." Catherine's professional mask slipped momentarily, irritation flashing across her features before control reasserted itself. "Perhaps it would be more productive to continue this discussion when emotions aren't running quite so high. Westfield's offer remains open for consideration." As she turned to leave, William stepped forward. "Miss Westfield, you should know that regardless of what happens with individual properties, we've requested formal historical district designation under State Preservation Statute 412. The regulatory landscape is changing, even if the physical one remains contested." The information landed with visible impact. A corporate executive suddenly recognizing that local resistance had escalated beyond the parameters of their strategic planning. Without responding directly, Catherine departed, the click of her heels on the wooden floor, marking a deliberate withdrawal rather than surrender. In her wake, the community remained unified but uncertain. Historical intervention might slow corporate development, but couldn't immediately resolve the financial pressures that had made landowners vulnerable to begin with. The 21-day stay on the Hawthorne auction represented breathing room rather than lasting solution. "What now?" asked Robert Johnson, regret evident in his expression as he contemplated the agreement he had already signed. "Some of us can't afford to wait for government processes, no matter how well-intentioned." His question cut to the heart of their collective vulnerability, the gap between principle and practical survival that had allowed corporate interests to gain footholds throughout rural America. Before William could respond, Michael stepped forward. The hesitancy that had characterized him earlier now replaced by clear purpose. "What if we created our own preservation trust?" he suggested, the idea clearly forming as he spoke. Not as a response to Westfield, but as a proactive community structure. Historical preservation grants can be directed toward covenant properties with significant community participation. If we established a legal framework that honored the original covenants while creating collective management, we could access preservation funding while maintaining individual ownership. Arjun nodded with growing interest. That approach aligns. With several emerging preservation frameworks, the Historical Commission has been developing support mechanisms for exactly this type of community heritage resilience. Jessica Miller added, "From a legal perspective, establishing the trust before additional properties transfer would create jurisdictional protections that would significantly complicate development strategies targeting covenant erasure." The conversation shifted from defense to initiative, from resisting corporate acquisition to building community alternatives. Landowners who had been considering Westfield's purchase offers began discussing trust frameworks instead, their generational connection to the land-finding expression in collective determination rather than individual surrender. As the meeting evolved into working groups focused on specific aspects of the emerging plan, William found himself standing slightly apart, watching the transformation with complex emotion. The community's response had exceeded anything he might have imagined when facing auction alone just hours earlier. Dr. Reynolds, who had arrived midway through the meeting and observed from the back, joined him in this moment of reflection. "You've built something significant here tonight, Mr. Anderson." "They built it themselves," William corrected gently. "They just needed to see the bigger picture." "That's often true of most conflicts," the professor observed. "Individual experience rarely reveals the full historical landscape without broader perspective." He studied the engaged community with professional assessment. "Your neighbors may have begun this evening thinking about individual property decisions, but they're ending it with collective heritage planning. That's a fundamental shift in orientation." William nodded, recognizing the truth in his analysis. "On the farm, we learned that lasting fertility couldn't be established through single-season decisions. It required investment in practices that transcended immediate yields. The same principle applies historically," Dr. Reynolds agreed. "Cultural heritage represents a resource that we've perhaps taken for granted for too long." Their conversation was interrupted by Emma, who approached with the energetic purpose that had characterized her throughout the evening. "Dad, we need you in the mapping group. They're trying to locate the original Covenant stone based on Michael's research. As William rejoined the community planning, the atmosphere in the Grange Hall had transformed from the grim determination of besieged individuals to the dynamic engagement of collective purpose. Maps spread across tables showed property boundaries, now overlaid with historical Covenant markers. Landowners with technical knowledge discussed survey requirements, while others addressed trust governance questions. Michael had found an unlikely role as facilitator, his analytical abilities and archival background allowing him to bridge different perspectives and synthesize complex information into actionable frameworks. The distance that had sometimes existed between him and the agricultural community had dissolved through shared purpose. By midnight, when the meeting finally concluded, the foundation had been established for what they were calling the Riverdale Heritage Covenant Trust. Initial commitments had been secured from 23 property owners, representing nearly 65% of the original Covenant lands, with others considering participation. Legal frameworks would require development, regulatory approvals would need navigation, and financial structures remained to be established. But the essential shift from corporate development to community preservation had been initiated. As people departed, carrying with them not just information, but renewed determination, William found himself standing in the parking lot beside his truck, watching neighbors exchange handshakes and purposeful nods. Jack Thompson approached, his weathered face bearing the first genuine smile William had seen in months. "Quite a day," the older man observed, looking back at the Grange Hall where lights still burned as the core planning team finalized documentation. "When you went to that auction this morning, I don't think any of us expected to end up here." "Sometimes the worst days open unexpected doors," William replied, the philosophical observation reflecting his farming experience as much as the day's events. "Though we're still a long way from resolving everything." "True enough," Jack acknowledged. "But the difference between fighting alone and fighting together makes even long odds seem more manageable." As Jack departed with a small wave, William found his family gathering beside the truck, Emma with her notebook full of trust planning details, Michael still discussing implementation strategies with Jessica Miller. All of them energized despite the late hour and intense day. "Ready to head home?" William asked, the simple question carrying deeper significance after hours of fighting to preserve that very concept. "Actually," Michael began, uncharacteristic uncertainty in his expression, "I was thinking I might stay at the farm tonight. Dr. Reynolds has temporarily assigned me to the local authentication team, and there's a lot of work to do on the Covenant. Mapping, the request revealed more than just logistical convenience. It represented Michael's reconnection to the family property he had distanced himself from in pursuing his academic career. Not a permanent return, but a significant redrawing of boundaries." "Your room's exactly as you left it," William replied, the simple acceptance conveying more than elaborate welcome could have. "Though Emma's been using your desk for her college applications, I can clear a corner," Emma offered with a grin, the close relationship she had developed with her uncle, despite their different paths, reasserting itself. As they drove through the darkness toward the farm that had nearly been lost that morning, the headlights illuminated familiar landmarks that now carried new significance, not just as features of their individual property, but as components of a Covenant community beginning to recognize its interconnected heritage. The day that had begun with solemn resignation had transformed through unexpected intervention and community mobilization. The 21-day reprieve still represented merely a pause rather than resolution, and the battle against corporate development remained daunting in its scope. But something fundamental had shifted. The isolation that had made individual landowners vulnerable had given way to collective determination that created new possibilities. When they crested the final hill before the farm, The familiar silhouette of buildings against the night sky triggered a complex surge of emotion in William. Gratitude for the temporary reprieve, determination regarding the challenges ahead, but most prominently, renewed purpose beyond mere preservation. The land that had represented personal heritage now connected to community legacy in ways that transcended individual ownership. As they turned onto the gravel driveway, headlights briefly illuminated the faded sign his grandfather had erected in 1952, Anderson Family Farm, cultivating more than crops. The words that had seemed like simple sentiment that morning now carried prophetic significance as they returned not just as individual family, but as members of an emerging trust that might redefine heritage preservation for the entire region. Battle was far from won, the stay of auction merely a temporary reprieve. But something more valuable than simple extension had been secured, the transformation from isolated vulnerability to collective strength, from defensive resistance to proactive community governance. Whatever Westfield's next move might be, they would face not a scattered collection of individual landowners, but an increasingly unified community recognizing their essential interconnection. As William parked beside the weathered farmhouse that had witnessed 3 generations of family history, the temporary reprieve granted by historical intervention had already catalyzed something more significant than mere delay. The 21 days ahead would determine not just the fate of the Anderson farm, but potentially the future of historical preservation. Throughout the Covenant region, the path forward remained challenging and uncertain, corporate resources vastly outweighing community capital, legal complexities requiring navigation, and financial pressures continuing to threaten vulnerable properties. But as William stepped from the truck onto land that remained, at least temporarily, in family hands, the day's transformation from defeat to possibility represented the essential first step in a campaign that had expanded far beyond one farmer's fight for his family legacy. Dawn broke over the Anderson farm with golden rays stretching across dew-dampened fields. William stood on the porch with his coffee, watching as the sun reclaimed the land from darkness. 5 days had passed since the courthouse intervention and the formation of the Riverdale Heritage Covenant Trust. His kitchen had transformed into an impromptu command center, the dining table now covered with maps, historical documents, and laptops. Michael emerged, his own coffee steaming in the cool morning air. His brother had slept at the farm every night since the auction stay, bridging years of gradual separation. "We got another 2 commitments last night," Michael reported. "The Simmons place and, surprisingly, the old Peterson homestead. That puts us at 28 properties, representing nearly 70% of the original Covenant lands." The Petersons were deep in negotiations with Westfield. What changed their minds? Apparently, Catherine Westfield suggested they might need to remove their historic barn for aesthetic consistency within the development. 6 generations of craftsmanship and a corporate executive tells them it doesn't fit their design concept. Michael shook his head. "Some battles are won by the opposition's mistakes." "Jessica is bringing the trust charter documentation this morning," William noted. "If we can get the framework legally established before Westfield counters, it creates significant protection against their development strategy." "Speaking of Westfield's plans," Michael began, "Arjun's research team identified significant movement yesterday. Corporate executives flying in from multiple offices, architectural firms arriving at their field office, and communication with county officials suggesting zoning maneuvers. They're mobilizing resources. The question is whether it's for direct confrontation or some flanking approach we haven't anticipated." Emma's voice called from inside. "Dad, the county news is running a story about us." They moved quickly to the living room, where the regional morning news was mid-segment. concerns about historical preservation and development tensions. Academic authorities have temporarily halted several property transfers in Riverdale County, pending investigation into what some are calling aggressive acquisition practices by Westfield Developments. Local farmer William Anderson, whose family farm was scheduled for auction last week, has become the focal point of community response that includes the formation of a historical preservation trust. The screen showed footage of the Grange Hall meeting, followed by a brief interview with Jack Thompson. The segment concluded with mention of the historical investigation and the temporary stay on auction proceedings. "They're going public with counter-messaging," Michael observed. "The press conference will probably announce some heritage park designed to reframe their development as preservation rather than erasure, which means we need to have our trust legally established before they create confusion," William concluded. "Let's get everyone assembled here by 10. The morning unfolded with coordinated purpose. Phone calls activated their community network. Jessica Miller arrived with the finalized legal documents, and Arjun provided updates on Westfield's movements. By noon, the Anderson farmyard had transformed into something between community gathering and field headquarters. Trucks and cars lined the driveway as property owners arrived to sign the founding charter. Dr. Reynolds moved through the gathering, his academic attire exchanged for practical field clothing. Inside the farmhouse, William and Michael hosted the core planning committee, reviewing their response strategy for Westfield's anticipated announcements. Current signatories represent 71% of the covenant acreage, Jessica reported. That exceeds the threshold for historical district designation under state regulations. Once filed with the county recorder's office, the charter establishes legal standing that would require any developer to negotiate with the trust rather than individual landowners. "What about the document authentication?" asked Sarah Miller, whose orchard had been operating on razor-thin margins for years. "Significant progress," confirmed Dr. Reynolds. "The handwriting analysis matches authenticated colonial documents from the Williams collection in Charleston. Ink composition testing has confirmed period-appropriate materials, and the paper fiber analysis supports mid-18th century production." "What about the investigation into authentication delays?" Martin Miller pressed. Arjun responded with measured precision. "The investigation remains ongoing, but preliminary findings suggest systematic rather than coincidental patterns in processing timelines. The specific mechanism and responsible parties haven't yet been identified, but statistical analysis confirms targeting rather than random bureaucratic inefficiency." A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the kitchen window, they could see media vehicles arriving, reporters and camera operators setting up equipment. "They're getting footage before Westfield's press conference," Michael observed. William dispatched Jack, Sarah, and Martin to speak with the media, recognizing the strategic value of presenting diverse community voices rather than focusing exclusively on his individual situation. William's phone rang with a state capital area code. The call was brief but significant. "That was Senator Harrison's office," he reported when he returned. "Westfield's board chairman is personally attending today's press conference, flying in from corporate headquarters. They've also requested meetings with the governor and state preservation board." He paused. "They're escalating this beyond local management to executive decision level." "They wouldn't commit those resources unless they felt genuinely threatened," Arjun observed. "Your trust represents a more significant obstacle than they initially calculated. Or they've identified a regulatory approach that they believe will circumvent our structure," countered Jessica. "Board chairman involvement often precedes major policy announcements or significant legal maneuvers." Their strategy session was interrupted by Emma, who burst through the door with uncharacteristic urgency. "We found it," she exclaimed, her expression animated with discovery. "The Covenant Stone. It's exactly where Michael's maps predicted, at the north corner of the old field." The announcement created immediate excitement, the abstract historical claims suddenly anchored in physical reality. Within minutes, the planning team had relocated to the site Emma had identified, a previously unremarkable corner of William's property where erosion from recent heavy rains had exposed what appeared to be a deliberately placed stone marker. Partially buried in the rich soil, the limestone marker stood approximately 3 feet high, with clearly visible carved symbols on its exposed face. Dr. Reynolds knelt beside it, carefully brushing away soil to reveal colonial-era markings. "This is extraordinary," he murmured, his academic detachment momentarily overcome by genuine wonder. "These are covenant symbols documented in colonial governance records, but rarely found intact in field settings." His fingers traced the worn markings with reverent precision, the central symbol representing community governance, surrounded by markers for shared resources, boundary respects, and reciprocal obligations. "It's exactly as described in the original documents," Michael confirmed, comparing the stone to illustrations in the colonial records he had brought from the research center. "The primary covenant marker from which all regional boundaries were established. So this isn't just a boundary stone," Emma said slowly, recognition dawning. "It's the actual center point of the entire covenant system. Not just physically, but conceptually," Dr. Reynolds agreed. "Colonial governance often anchored social contracts in physical landmarks, a manifestation of abstract principles in tangible form. The significance settled over the gathering with profound weight. What had begun as a desperate attempt to save the Anderson farm had uncovered a physical cornerstone of the region's founding principles that directly challenged the unchecked development Westfield represented. As word spread, community members gathered around the stone, many taking photographs or simply standing in contemplative silence before this tangible connection to their shared past. William stood slightly apart, watching as neighbors who had often been divided by contemporary pressures found common ground. In this rediscovered heritage, the stone represented more than just historical validation. It embodied principles of stewardship and interconnection that had guided the region's development for centuries before corporate interests had begun their systematic erasure. "This changes everything," Jessica observed quietly as she joined him. "A documented covenant marker of this significance triggers automatic interim protection under the State Antiquities Act, independent of our trust formation or the historical authentication process." "Will that stop Westfield?" William asked. "Not permanently," she acknowledged, "but it creates a regulatory framework they can't simply bypass with political connections or financial pressure. Some protections transcend even the most determined development efforts." The discovery injected new energy into their community mobilization. What had been abstract historical claims now had concrete physical manifestation, a literal foundation stone upon which their preservation efforts could build. As the afternoon progressed, word of the discovery spread throughout Riverdale County, drawing additional landowners who had been hesitant to commit to the trust. The physical evidence proved more compelling than any legal argument or historical documentation, a direct connection to founding principles that transcended contemporary economic pressures. By the time Westfield's scheduled press conference began, the Anderson farm had become the focal point of regional attention. The Covenant Stone, already recognized as potentially the most significant historical discovery in the county's recent history. The Riverdale County Administrative Building stood in stark contrast to the historical structures surrounding it, a modernist statement of glass and steel erected during the economic boom of the early 2000s. Today, its central press room had been transformed into a corporate showcase, with Westfield Development's distinctive logo prominently displayed on the podium, and professional lighting arranged to highlight the architectural renderings mounted on easels around the room. Richard Westfield, the rarely seen chairman and founder of the Development Corporation, stood at the center of a huddle of executives making last-minute adjustments to their presentation. At 67, he maintained the commanding presence that had built a multi-billion-dollar development empire, his silver hair and bespoke suit projecting authority and unshakable confidence. Catherine stood slightly apart, her expression carefully neutral as she monitored incoming messages on her phone. The unexpected discovery at the Anderson farm had necessitated rushed revisions to their announcement strategy, evident in the tension rippling through the corporate team. Local media filled the front rows, but the presence of state and even national outlets suggested the story had escalated beyond a typical rural development dispute. Representatives from historical preservation organizations and environmental groups clustered together, their murmured conversations creating an undercurrent of anticipation. Mayor Wilson stood near the side entrance, his political smile strained as he greeted various constituents. His administration had heavily promoted Westfield's development as an economic salvation for a region struggling with agricultural decline, making today's announcement particularly consequential for his political future. At precisely 2:00 p.m., Richard Westfield approached the podium with practiced confidence, cameras tracking his movement and microphones capturing his carefully modulated voice. "Good afternoon. I'm Richard Westfield, founder and chairman of Westfield Developments. I've come to Riverdale County today to announce a significant evolution in our Hawthorne Estates project, one that we believe represents a perfect synthesis of progress and preservation." He gestured toward the architectural renderings as an assistant unveiled them with theatrical timing. The displays showed a master-planned community where modern luxury homes were interspersed with carefully preserved historical features, all centered around what appeared to be a park-like heritage center. Today, I'm pleased to announce Hawthorne Historical Village, a revolutionary approach to development that honors the rich heritage of this remarkable region while bringing much-needed economic revitalization and modern amenities. The presentation continued with practiced precision, highlighting job creation numbers, tax revenue projections, and architectural features designed to reference historical elements while providing luxury accommodations. The centerpiece of the proposal was a dedicated heritage conservation zone that would preserve selected historical features within a controlled environment, rather than allowing historical assets to deteriorate through neglect or insufficient resources. Westfield continued, his voice conveying rehearsed conviction. Our approach integrates them into a sustainable development model that ensures their preservation while providing economic benefits to the entire community. As the presentation shifted to specific plans, the double doors at the back of the room opened quietly. William Anderson entered, accompanied by Dr. Reynolds, Michael, and Emma. They took positions along the back wall, their arrival causing a subtle ripple of reaction through the assembled media. Richard Westfield noted their presence with a nearly imperceptible pause before smoothly continuing. We've adjusted our original plans in response to community input, integrating historical considerations while maintaining the economic viability that will benefit every resident of Riverdale County. The presentation concluded with renderings of a colonial heritage center that would celebrate the region's unique history through interactive exhibits and educational programming. In closing, Westfield stated with practiced sincerity, Westfield Developments has always believed that progress and preservation can work together. Our revised Hawthorne Historical Village represents that philosophy in concrete form, honoring the past while building for the future. As the planned question period began, reporters initially focused on economic projections and construction timelines. The corporate team fielded these with practiced efficiency until a journalist from the State Historical Review raised her hand. "Mr. Westfield, your presentation doesn't address the covenant stone discovered this morning on the Anderson property, which state archaeologists are already calling the most significant colonial governance artifact found in the region in decades. How does your development plan account for this discovery?" A momentary flash of irritation crossed the chairman's face before his media training reasserted control. "We've just learned of this discovery ourselves and will certainly incorporate appropriate acknowledgement of any authenticated historical artifacts into our heritage conservation program." "Acknowledgement," the reporter pressed. "The preliminary assessment suggests this isn't just an artifact, but the central marker of a legally binding colonial covenant system that established specific restrictions on development throughout the region, restrictions that would fundamentally conflict with your proposed construction." Catherine Westfield stepped forward. "Westfield Developments has extensive experience integrating historical considerations into modern development. While we respect the academic interest in colonial artifacts, the practical reality of modern community needs must balance theoretical historical provisions." From the back of the room, Dr. Reynolds stepped forward, his academic authority evident even without formal introduction. "There's nothing theoretical about colonial covenants that were formally registered and never legally dissolved. The covenant stone isn't merely of academic interest. It's the physical manifestation of binding legal provisions that establish this community's founding governance." The room's energy shifted as reporters recognized the more compelling story unfolding. Not the carefully choreographed corporate announcement, but the direct confrontation between development interests and historical preservation. Richard Westfield maintained his composed demeanor. "Westfield Developments has always operated within complete legal compliance. If Historical Review identifies legitimate restrictions, we'll address them appropriately through established channels." William Anderson moved forward, his weathered dignity creating an immediate visual contrast with the corporate polish of the development team. "Those established channels have consistently delayed authentication of historical documents that would protect covenant properties. Delays that coincidentally facilitated your acquisition strategy, targeting those exact properties." The direct accusation created an immediate stir among the assembled media. Catherine attempted damage control, stepping forward with practiced grace. "Mr. Anderson's concerns reflect understandable attachment to his property, but Westfield has operated with complete transparency throughout this process." "Transparency?" Michael joined his brother, the historical documentation from his research prominently displayed in his hands. "Our statistical analysis shows that properties within the original covenant boundaries experienced authentication delays 312% longer than comparable historical properties outside Westfield's acquisition zone. That pattern stretches the definition of coincidence beyond credibility." As the corporate team struggled to regain narrative control, Emma stepped forward, her youth and direct manner creating yet another striking contrast to the corporate presentation. "Your heritage conservation zone reduces living history to a corporate exhibit," she stated, her voice clear and unwavering. "The covenants weren't established as tourist attractions, but as binding commitments between generations. Commitments your development would effectively erase while pretending to honor them." The press conference had devolved from controlled corporate messaging to a direct confrontation that captivated the media's attention. Camera operators who had been capturing standard corporate announcement footage now focused intensely on the unfolding drama between the Anderson family and the Westfield executives. Richard Westfield's practiced composure finally showed distinct strain. Westfield Developments has committed over $50 million to this project based on thorough legal review of property availability. While we respect historical interest, we cannot allow unfounded claims to derail economic progress, desperately needed by this community. Unfounded, Dr. Reynolds countered, his academic precision cutting through corporate rhetoric. The covenant system is thoroughly documented in colonial records. The identification of the physical marker provides tangible evidence of historically registered restrictions that were never legally superseded. The fundamental conflict had crystallized for everyone in attendance, not simply a dispute over one farm or auction, but a foundational question of what controlled the region's future: corporate development interests or historical governance. Principles established at its founding. As reporters called out increasingly pointed questions, Mayor Wilson attempted to reassert control, stepping to the podium with political optimism that seemed jarringly discordant with the tension filling the room. "I believe we all want what's best for Riverdale County," he began, with rehearsed conciliation. "Surely there's a compromise approach that honors our heritage while embracing economic opportunity." "Some principles aren't subject to compromise, Mayor," William replied, his farmer's directness cutting through political equivocation. "Our ancestors established covenant protections specifically to prevent certain types of development and resource exploitation. Those weren't suggestions. They were binding commitments between generations." The press conference had clearly escaped the carefully planned corporate narrative. Richard Westfield signaled to his team, and with practiced efficiency, they began their extraction strategy. Westfield Developments remains committed to responsible development that benefits communities while respecting their unique character, he stated, with concluding formality. "We look forward to productive dialogue with all stakeholders as this process continues." With that carefully constructed non-commitment, the corporate team moved toward their exit, surrounded by staff who effectively blocked further direct questioning. As they departed, media attention immediately shifted to the Anderson family and Dr. Reynolds, their impromptu press availability drawing the entire room's focus. "The Covenant Stone isn't just a historical curiosity," Dr. Reynolds explained to the gathered reporters. "It represents the physical manifestation of a governance system that established specific restrictions on development, resource use, and community structure, restrictions specifically designed to prevent exactly the type of development Westfield has proposed. Our family has honored those covenant obligations for 8 generations," William added, his straightforward dignity resonating through the room. "Not because they were legally enforced, but because they represented principles worth preserving. The idea that some values transcend immediate profit, and that we hold responsibility to both past and future generations." As the impromptu press conference continued, the contrast between the corporate presentation and the community response became increasingly evident. Westfield had offered economic projections, architectural renderings, and carefully massaged messaging. The Anderson family and their allies offered authentic connection to the land, tangible historical evidence, and principles that transcended quarterly profit reports. By the time they departed the county building, media coverage had already begun, shifting from development announces historical preservation initiative to colonial covenant discovery challenges corporate development plans. What Westfield had intended as a controlled announcement of their adaptive strategy had instead become a public crystallization of the fundamental conflict between development and preservation. As they walked toward their vehicles, Michael's phone signaled an incoming message. His expression transformed as he read the notification, a mixture of vindication and disbelief evident in his features. The State Historical Commission just issued an emergency protection order for the entire Covenant region, pending full authentication, he announced, looking up from his phone. all property transfers and development activities within the original. Boundary markers are suspended for 60 days under the State Antiquities Act. The announcement landed with momentous impact. Their temporary reprieve had just expanded beyond the Anderson farm to encompass the entire regional covenant system, creating a protective barrier against Westfield's development plans that transcended individual property boundaries. They can't just bulldoze history anymore, Emma observed, her expression reflecting the significance of this expanded protection. Not without a much bigger fight than they anticipated, William agreed, his farmers. Pragmatism tempered by cautious hope. As they departed the county building, the conflict had transformed from a single family's desperate stand against foreclosure to a fundamental question about community governance and historical preservation, a question that would now play out with state-level oversight and national media attention. The 21-day reprieve had become a 60-day protection zone, encompassing an entire historical region, creating breathing room for the authentication process and trust formation to continue without the immediate threat of development. The immediate battle hadn't been won, but the rules of engagement had shifted dramatically. Westfield's carefully constructed corporate strategy now faced not just scattered landowner resistance, but a coordinated preservation effort with academic validation, legal protection, and growing public support. 3 months had passed since the dramatic confrontation at the press conference. The mid-October morning carried the crisp clarity of autumn, frost outlining fallen leaves with crystalline precision. As William completed his morning walk around the property, the familiar routine had acquired new significance. Each acre represented not just personal heritage, but community covenant, a promise kept through generations. The landscape had transformed significantly since that July morning when he and Emma had driven towards seemingly inevitable defeat. Harvested fields lay in neat rows, awaiting spring renewal. Equipment stood cleaned and stored for winter dormancy, and most significantly, the covenant stone had been carefully excavated and protected with a simple but dignified stone enclosure, identifying it as the central marker of the Riverdale colonial covenant system. William paused near the stone, observing the morning light playing across its ancient carvings. Unlike Westfield's proposed Heritage Center, with its interactive displays and gift shop, this authentic historical marker stood in its original location, still serving its intended purpose, not as a tourist attraction, but as a tangible reminder of founding principles that continued to guide the community's development. "Deep thoughts at this hour?" called Michael from the driveway, where he had just arrived for their weekly trust meeting. His brother had developed an unexpected aptitude for heritage preservation, leveraging his academic abilities toward covenant documentation while maintaining his position at the state archives. Their relationship had transformed significantly through the preservation campaign, the distance that had sometimes separated them yielding to genuine partnership. "Just appreciating what almost wasn't," William replied with characteristic understatement. 3 months ago, I expected to be packing up this house. Now we're hosting the Trust's quarterly review. Inside the renovated farmhouse kitchen, the traditional family dining table had evolved into a combination workspace and planning center. Regional maps covered one wall, while historical documentation occupied adjacent shelving. The modest space represented their Trust's administrative headquarters, maintaining practical connection to the land while providing necessary coordination. Emma entered from the adjacent room that had been converted into a documentation center. Her university studies now focused on agricultural heritage preservation, a field she had helped revitalize through her work with the Trust. "The latest covenant boundary survey came in this morning," she reported, tablet displaying the comprehensive mapping that had been underway since August. The archaeological team confirmed the location of 5 more boundary markers, all consistent with the colonial documents Michael found. Her analytical comment exemplified their trust's fundamental approach, achieving systematic documentation while honoring the practical stewardship that had preserved these features through generations of care. Jack Thompson arrived next, followed by Sarah and Martin Miller, the core leadership team that had guided trust development since its emergency formation. Their monthly sessions had evolved from crisis response coordination to implementation planning as their governance framework transitioned from defensive resistance to proactive preservation. Final count from yesterday's heritage planting program. Jack reported, accepting coffee with weather-worn hands. 22 properties participated, including 9 that weren't initially threatened by Westfield. People are recognizing the value beyond just protection from development. This expanding participation represented important evolution beyond crisis mobilization, community members engaging with covenant principles through recognized benefits rather than merely threat response. The governance system was demonstrating practical value addressing legitimate agricultural challenges while maintaining historical continuity. The educational workshops are exceeding expectations, Emma added, summarizing community engagement metrics. 47 families participated in last week's session on historical farming techniques. The Agricultural Extension Office has requested our curriculum for potential implementation in other counties. The academic interest represented significant external validation. Their community response to corporate development had created a governance framework with potential application beyond their specific circumstances. What began as desperate resistance had evolved into an innovative model addressing fundamental questions about heritage preservation amid changing economic conditions. Their planning session proceeded with familiar efficiency, reviewing implementation, progress, addressing covenant documentation, and coordinating community education activities. The conversation reflected transformed priorities, from crisis management toward sustainable governance, from defensive positioning toward proactive development, from immediate threat response toward generational stewardship. Jessica Miller arrived. Midway through their session, her involvement having evolved from emergency legal representation toward ongoing partnership between their trust and the broader regulatory framework addressing heritage preservation. The State Historical Commission has formally approved the Riverdale Covenant District designation, she reported, distributing documentation reflecting the culmination of months of authentication work. The designation provides permanent protection, status for all identified covenant properties, and establishes the trust as the recognized governance authority for the district. The information confirmed the transformation of their temporary reprieve into lasting protection. Their defensive response to corporate development had secured not just a delay, but permanent legal standing that would guide the region's future development according to principles established at its founding. Any further movement from Westfield? William asked, maintaining appropriate vigilance despite their successful implementation progress. Significant corporate restructuring following their failed development attempt, Jessica confirmed. Their board has announced a strategic repositioning toward heritage-compatible development rather than comprehensive transformation, with revised implementation protocols emphasizing community consent rather than regulatory minimum compliance. The corporate language shift represented fundamental strategic adjustment rather than merely tactical repositioning. Westfield's failure to overcome covenant restrictions despite substantial resource deployment had necessitated comprehensive approach recalibration throughout their operations. Their revised approach actually incorporates several core elements from our trust governance model, Michael observed, reviewing documentation reflecting operational changes rather than simple messaging adjustment, including genuine community consultation, cultural heritage preservation requirements, and maintenance of historical landscape features within limited development. The assessment represented important validation beyond immediate protective victory. Their covenant governance framework had demonstrated sufficient viability to influence corporate methodology throughout the development industry. Dr. Reynolds arrived as scheduled, his involvement having evolved from emergency authentication toward ongoing advisory capacity. His academic team had spent months documenting the complete covenant system, creating the most comprehensive record of colonial governance structures ever assembled in the region. The National Register application has received preliminary approval, he announced. The Riverdale Covenant District represents one of the most intact examples of colonial community governance surviving into the modern era, a living connection to founding principles rather than merely preserved structures. As their meeting continued, William received an unexpected phone call from Mayor Wilson. The conversation lasted several minutes, his expression revealing significant political development requiring immediate sharing with the assembled leadership team. The county has approved establishment of a dedicated heritage preservation fund, supporting covenant implementation throughout the region, he reported upon concluding the call. Initial allocation of $2 million with potential matching from state historical preservation grants. Community governance provision, requiring trust administration rather than governmental management. The political development represented critical transition beyond protective positioning toward sustainable implementation. Public resources addressing preservation requirements while maintaining governance framework reflecting community determination rather than governmental control. The mayor specifically referenced the September Community Festival as transformative in public understanding regarding heritage value, William continued, acknowledging community mobilization impact beyond immediate protective objective. Seeing covenant principles in practice apparently catalyzed fundamental reassessment regarding the relationship between economic development and historical preservation. This recognition confirmed important dimension beyond formal legal or regulatory frameworks. Public appreciation, recognizing heritage preservation's economic and cultural benefits rather than seeing it merely as obstacle to development. As participants prepared to conclude their monthly meeting, Dr. Reynolds shared unexpected news from his ongoing authentication work. Our research team made a remarkable discovery yesterday, he announced, his academic precision animated by genuine excitement. We've identified documentation confirming that the Riverdale Covenant system was personally reviewed by Thomas Jefferson during his survey of colonial governance structures that influenced early constitutional thinking. The revelation landed with profound significance. Their local preservation effort had uncovered direct connection between their community governance principles and the foundational concepts of American democracy. The Covenant's emphasis on balancing individual rights with community obligations provides tangible example of principles that influenced national development, Dr. Reynolds continued. What began as local preservation has documented a living heritage of constitutional significance. As the meeting concluded and participants departed toward their respective properties throughout the Covenant region, William found himself momentarily reflecting on the transformed landscape since those desperate courthouse moments 3 months earlier. The threatened auction had catalyzed community response that developed governance framework, historical documentation, implementation methodology, and now permanent protection supporting sustainable heritage preservation beyond specific corporate threat. Michael remained behind, the brothers' weekly strategy session evolving toward broader reflections regarding agricultural heritage within changing economic conditions. Their complementary perspectives continued providing essential balance between historical understanding and practical implementation, creating integrated approach addressing both immediate preservation requirements and longer-term sustainability. Considerations. Did you ever imagine we'd be here when you were driving toward the courthouse that morning? Michael asked, their conversation shifting toward philosophical assessment beyond specific organizational development. Managing a covenant district with national historical significance, academic partnership, state protection, and dedicated financial support? Started with just trying to save the farm, William acknowledged with characteristic understatement. Though experience taught me how individual circumstances often reveal essential principles, requiring collective response rather than isolated resistance. Their conversation reflected genuine appreciation for the unexpected journey, from individual vulnerability toward community resilience, from desperate preservation toward innovative governance, from isolated protection toward collective determination. The threatened farm had become connection point within covenant framework, addressing fundamental heritage preservation beyond immediate development threat, creating methodology with potential generational significance throughout similar communities facing comparable challenges. 2 years later, the Riverdale County Courthouse hosted dramatically different gathering from that tense auction morning, a regional heritage preservation conference highlighting the Covenant District's implementation achievements and governance innovations. Representatives from 15 states attended, including preservation officials, community organizers, historical societies, and federal agency personnel studying their framework for potential implementation throughout rural America. William stood near the entrance, observing proceedings with measured satisfaction, reflecting farmers' assessment rather than personal pride. The conference represented significant validation beyond specific preservation circumstances. Their defensive response to corporate development had created implementation methodology, addressing fundamental heritage questions with potential application. Throughout similar regions facing comparable challenges, Emma approached from educational demonstration session where she had presented the Trust's community engagement program to visiting preservation organizations. Her studies had evolved toward specialized focus on agricultural heritage governance, combining academic research with practical implementation experience. The New England delegation is particularly interested in our governance structure, she reported with characteristic analytical precision. Their historical preservation challenges make our community-based approach especially relevant despite different regional traditions. The external validation represented important confirmation beyond local circumstances, their governance framework demonstrating potential application throughout diverse communities despite specific development addressing Riverdale's unique covenant. Sister Michael emerged from documentation coordination session where he had facilitated discussion between trust leadership, state historians, and federal representatives regarding preservation standards, balancing authentic heritage with contemporary needs. The National Archive has formally requested our complete covenant documentation for their permanent collection, he reported with characteristic precision, complementing Emma's assessment. The governance framework we developed under emergency conditions has officially become referenced methodology throughout similar preservation districts facing development pressure. This national validation confirmed significant impact beyond specific trust development. Their community response creating governance approach with recognized application throughout comparable rural areas facing similar heritage preservation challenges. Dr. Reynolds joined their conversation, his involvement having evolved from emergency authentication toward national advisory capacity within broader academic consideration regarding living heritage preservation. His historical perspective continued, providing essential context, connecting their local implementation with national significance regarding community governance principles. Your covenant model has fundamentally influenced heritage preservation. Methodology beyond specific regional application, he observed with characteristic academic precision. The integration of living community practice, historical documentation, and contemporary governance represents significant advancement addressing essential relationship between cultural heritage and modern development. The assessment acknowledged broader impact beyond immediate corporate resistance. Their defensive response had developed governance framework addressing fundamental questions regarding community determination, heritage preservation, and sustainable development within changing economic conditions. The methodology balanced legitimate contemporary needs with essential historical principles, creating viable alternative to both unprotected vulnerability and artificial museum-style preservation that removed heritage from living community context. As scheduled programming concluded, William found himself standing momentarily alone near courthouse entrance, where auction had nearly eliminated his family's heritage. The building that had represented desperate vulnerability now hosted conference celebrating governance framework catalyzed through that threatened loss, creating profound symmetry between individual circumstance and community determination. Mayor Wilson approached, his political perspective having evolved significantly through covenant implementation experience, creating community leadership, recognizing essential relationship between heritage preservation and sustainable development beyond simplistic economic growth metrics. Quite different from that auction morning, he observed, acknowledging transformative journey since those tense moments when corporate development seemed inevitable outcome rather than transformative catalyst. Though I suspect none of us anticipated precisely where that confrontation would ultimately lead, William nodded, acknowledging the unexpected path from individual threat to community transformation. In farming, we learn that some seasons begin with what looks like catastrophe, but end with unexpected harvest. Their conversation reflected mutual recognition regarding extraordinary journey from individual auction toward community governance, from desperate preservation toward innovative methodology, from threatened loss toward covenant implementation, addressing fundamental heritage sustainability beyond specific corporate development. The farm that narrowly escaped auction had become connection point within covenant governance framework, addressing fundamental sustainability questions beyond specific development threat, creating methodology with recognized implementation potential throughout comparable regions facing similar challenges. What began with humble farmer facing foreclosure had evolved into innovative governance framework with national implementation potential, addressing fundamental questions regarding community determination, heritage preservation, and sustainable development throughout rural America. The journey from desperate courthouse confrontation toward recognized methodological advancement represented essential transformation beyond specific corporate resistance, creating heritage preservation approach with potential generational significance throughout comparable communities facing similar challenges. The weathered parchment that William had pulled from his pocket that fateful morning had ultimately catalyzed governance framework, addressing fundamental questions regarding heritage. Determination in contemporary America, balancing legitimate development needs with essential historical principles, integrating modern capabilities with covenant wisdom, combining scientific documentation with generational stewardship values. Up next, you've got two more remarkable stories right on your screen. If this one resonated with you, you won't want to miss these. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload from us. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.